To do now is talk a little bit about these principles, and it sounds as though I'm delivering these from on high. The idea really is to take a look at what people who've written about Canada's relations think guides the relationship, and to test it against you as stakeholders in the reality that you're living every day. There's nothing, sacred or inviolable about these principles, just that this is what people who study the relationship think about how it works. And the reason that I wanted to put this out at the outset is we're living in such an interesting and somewhat turbulent time. We've seen in this current U.S. election some real debates about things we thought might have gone away. Protectionism, maybe some isolationism, a little bit of nativism. It seems as though a lot of what we thought we understood about American leadership in the 20th century might be up for grabs. We saw Justin Trudeau bring a very new, youthful approach, not only to the Liberal Party, but to the campaign last fall. And it really struck a lot of Canadians in a very powerful way. So if we're moving in new directions, does the old sort of body of principles still hold weight? Is this still how we want to run the relationship? We've changed. Is this still the basis for a good friendship? And so here is the little thing. Now, partly, we have actually, it was very interesting. I know Stephen Harper was a bit obsessed by it, but in 2014, we celebrated 200 years of peace, and I actually saw a little bit of more of that celebration in England than I saw here, really recognizing that since the War of 1812, we've been getting along reasonably well. As I say, the principles for guiding the relationship have been around since then, not necessarily written down, but I've tried to distill them for you and draw them out of the literature. This next slide gives you a sense of the literature itself. I realize that's nerdy, but we love citations in academia, and I know Catherine said, don't worry, the principles aren't academic and irrelevant, but coming from the doctor-professor business, I think academic means super relevant and excellent and cool. So you'll see in this next slide just a little bit of the literature that's guided us along the way. Some old, some new, most of it from the last couple of years, or at least the last couple of decades since the Vietnam War. So the question that I want to ask with all of these, and I would like you to be thinking about, and after the presentation, I think you'll hear Catherine kind of prompt you to tell us what you think about, is do we still believe in these principles? We should be like 2 slides down now. This is one of the things. Do I have a clicker? I guess I do, don't I? There's a man in the back saying, you idiot. All right, so let's see. Yeah, there we go. The question is, do we still believe? And I hopefully, this is a question not just on politics and do we still believe in the principles, but also are they relevant for the supply chains that we operate now? Are they relevant for an instant communications world where politicians are connected to the public by social media as much as by the news media and Walter Cronkite and sort of the old models, which were valid when much of the literature was written? So the first is the idea of partnership. Charles Duran, who some of you know, wrote about this in 1984. For Duran, the issue of partnership was fundamental. It's why I started with it. He looked back at a relationship that had been fairly positive from the end of World War II up until the time when Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister. And at the time of the current Prime Minister's father's governments, Canada-US relations seemed to be going through a bumpy patch. For Duran, the idea of partnership had been lost during the 60s and 70s, and he called for it in the 80s to be brought back. Many people felt that with Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan singing When Irish Eyes Were Smiling in Quebec City, that the partnership was back. But the fundamental principle for Duran was that even though Canada and the US are different sizes, there are lots of differences between us, when it comes to management of the relationship, we treat each other as equals. Treat each other as equals, and we manage our affairs as partners, not as junior partners or hegemons, to use a fancy academic word, and subservient Canada, but as a true partnership. And we paper over the differences because we have a mutual sense of respect for each other's sovereignty. Second principle is the principle of interdependence. And Duran talked a little bit about this as well, that as the US and Canada became increasingly economically interdependent, we committed to that being a good thing in both countries. Now, this obviously occurred most powerfully with Canada's free trade and later NAFTA, but we're still working on the basis that interdependence and connectivity between the two societies should be deepened and is a good thing. As a result of that belief, many businesses across our region, especially here in Ohio, have connected their supply chains, made investments across the border, have bet on that interdependence. Do we still believe that deepening interdependence is a principle worth pursuing? A third principle, rule of law. And I know that sounds abstract, but John Holmes, writing in his famous book, Life with Uncle, many of you will know, a distinguished Canadian diplomat, now no longer with us, but wrote that in the end, what was important for the Canada-US relationship was a rule of law, that there were principles that when the US loses a softwood lumber dispute at the WTO or a NAFTA panel, we abide by the decision and follow those rules. Now, many people point out the US doesn't always do that, but that there should be a rule and that we should follow the rules and not have our relationship managed by who's stronger or who needs votes from what part of their country, but really on a set of rules that we agree to in treaties, in trade agreements that set up the foundation for managing conflict, because conflict is inevitable. Not that we should manage everything on an ad hoc basis, pulling together a coalition and trying to deal with it that way. That the principle of rule of law is very essential for John Holmes. Do we still believe in that? Related to that, Duran comes back with the idea that as greater economic interdependence grows, we need a degree of institutionalization. And the reason for institutionalization is so that we don't find ourselves constantly relying on market interventions, firms to resolve problems. We're constantly looking for a new intermediator or a new broker. That there's a degree to which we should institutionalize aspects of the relationship so that we don't have to renegotiate them for every dispute. So we can all rely on those institutions to help navigate us through conflicts. Significant here, Duran called on us to be less reliant on politics. We all love politics, and of course we have some political leaders who are going to be part of this discussion today. But for Duran, politics has an element of arbitrariness, and where do you get your votes from to get reelected? He calls on us to have institutions that manage this as far away from the political as possible. Is that still valid? When Trudeau and Obama get along so well, do we want a more political management of the relationship or a less political management of the relationship? Brian Bowe, who's a much younger scholar, I say that because he's closer to my age. He's a little younger, actually, so I'm pretending that I'm also young, but, you know, we all do that a little bit, especially in academia. It's a terrible business, by the way. Those of you who are in business probably have a little bit of this with new employees, but academia is terrible because you keep doing it, and every year the kids are roughly the same age, always young, and so you get older, but they're always young, and you just feel really like you're steps closer to dead, and gradually your jokes stop working because nobody understands your references anymore. I had a joke I used to use all the time, and I thought it was pretty good. It was sort of a reference to Star Trek. You know, and I thought, all right, Star Trek, kids get that, that's cool. And I used to use the Star Trek joke, and the kids laughed, actually, at one of my jokes. I thought that worked really well. And I said to one of the kids, yeah, I thought that worked pretty well. And he said, yeah, I don't actually know what you're talking about, but I think it was a punchline on Family Guy. So one way or the other, you know, at least these things do come back. So the next concept comes from Brian, and Brian really writes about linkage. When the countries are as interdependent as we are, Canada and the US, linking issues can be counterproductive. If Canada is willing to continue to have troops fighting against the Islamic State, should we link that to giving them a deal on softwood lumber? After all, they're helping us over here. Should we try to cut them a break over there? In practice, many diplomats, and Brian picks up on this in his research, argue that those kinds of linkages look like they're an opportunistic way to get a trade-off, but they rarely work. And they can often be counterproductive in suggesting that Canada makes big commitments to things like fighting the Islamic State, almost like Canadian troops are for sale. And that this might not be the right way to manage the relationship. partly because the U.S. always has more things to trade than Canada, and that this could become a very difficult bargaining process. So Brian warns us against linkage. But should we maybe explore linkage? We're so interdependent. Do we need to sort of leverage some of the things that Canada can bring to us, whether it's building the Gordie Howe Bridge or the Keystone Pipeline, against some of the other things that the U.S. needs? It may be a way of managing in a very asymmetrical space. Now, I had to go back to John Sloan Dickey, who some of you will remember associated famously with Dartmouth, who wrote a lot about the trends in the relationship. And he had a famous book called Canada and the American Presence, about the shadow that the U.S. has in Canadian life. He's American himself. But he wrote that ultimately for the U.S., even though it may seem counterproductive, we want a stronger and more independent-minded Canada. That it's ultimately better for Canada to have high self-esteem and be a bit willing to stand up for itself. We don't want a Canada who is a weaker partner. For many years I worked with John Hamre, who's the head of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and was formerly the Deputy Secretary of Defense working at the Pentagon, and one of his great lines is, the United States may be the only superpower in the history of the world that wanted a stronger power on its borders. But it's actually true in many ways. Historically, the U.S. has pushed for Canada to be more capable in defense, more capable of governance domestically, more out in the world, more invested in international relations. We want Canada to be strong. And at the same time, Dickey warns us that nationalistic policies on either side, whether it's the U.S. after September 11 or Pierre Trudeau's economic nationalism in the 60s and 70s, can make it harder to manage the relationship. So we want strong and independent, but not too nationalistic. It's a tough balance. Dickey writes about how to strike that balance. Does that kind of rhetoric even matter anymore? Is it important for us to avoid nationalism, but also promote Canadian sovereignty and Canadian standing up for themselves, the Canadian self-esteem? Or is that actually more of a problem? Are we going to find, like Europe, that if Britain feels more strongly British than European, it might consider leaving, that Canada, if it feels more strongly Canadian, might decide that North America is only one of its options and perhaps not the most important? What's the role of independence and nationalism in our thinking and our way of treating one another? You could add to that now, and I don't want to start a political debate, but you could add to that now the Trump effect. Is the U.S. going through a period of nationalism itself, and it would rather be independent, take care of itself, and put allies on notice that you either bear your burdens or you're a loser? Well, he would say that. I would never call Canada a loser. Nice people. But the idea of nationalism and independence is one that can work both ways, not just for Canada, but also for the U.S. And how does that interplay with the issues that matter to us? Next, I tried to draw this out from the famous Merchant Heaney report. Some of you will remember this. It was written in the 60s. I know that goes back a long way. But Livingston Merchant and Arthur Heaney were former ambassadors. And Heaney had been Canadian ambassador in the U.S., Livingston Merchant had been U.S. ambassador in Canada. And after they served as ambassador, the Canadian government asked them to take a look at this relationship. This would have been in the Pearson years, to take a look at the relationship and offer principles for guiding the relationship. In some ways, this presentation harkens back to their role. And one of the things that they drew out that was quite controversial in its time was the idea that apart from, say, special interests or obligations we have to speak up, as much as possible, Canada and the U.S., the governments of both countries, the president, the prime minister, the Congress, the Parliament, should avoid public disagreement. We shouldn't argue in public. Now, obviously, we have differences. We have to negotiate on softwood lumber. We have to negotiate on issues. But we should avoid calling names in public or airing our grievances. Better to do things behind the scenes quietly. When that report came out, many Canadian nationalists argued that it was an argument for Canada to shut up and be quiet, and to put up with whatever came out of the U.S. And so it was controversial. They said, this is not how we shouldn't be told that we can't have things in public. Sometimes you just have to speak up. But is it better to avoid those fights? Is it better to not have public disagreements souring the relationship? Is it better for us to keep the language of Canada's relations peaceful, restate friendship, etc., and then let the diplomats do their work behind the scenes. It's a controversial principle, but I raise it for your thinking, and to see whether you find that that kind of thing is still relevant. Then, this notion of leaders. One of the things, and Holmes talks a little bit about this is a quote from Holmes, actually. Holmes worried about the degree to which we tend to focus on the president and the prime minister and the management of the relationship, and forget that the reason the two countries are friends is more that the people like each other, and the leaders are who we have at the moment. So he's writing in the 80s, he remembers that many Canadians didn't like Richard Nixon. He was kind of a figure that they didn't care for very much. We can remember other US presidents that Canadians might have liked more or less. Similarly, there are Americans who like a Canadian prime minister if they actually know who they are, and then there are sometimes the Canadian prime minister makes no dent on American public consciousness. Now that Justin Trudeau's been in vogue and done all sorts of things on Twitter, I think he's probably got a higher profile than most Canadian prime ministers do. I remember when I was young in Canadian studies and we were talking about Pierre Trudeau, who had a pretty high profile himself. I did go to a conference actually in that state to the north, Michigan, and we were talking about Trudeau, and one of the people in the audience said, "That's the Doonesbury guy, right?" Now that joke doesn't work with students now because nobody reads Doonesbury anymore, but at the time he was the more famous Trudeau. Well, now I think Justin is generally the most famous Trudeau around. But Holmes worried about our tendency to focus on the leaders who will save us from everything. If only Obama knew about what was going on, he would fix it. If only Trudeau could focus on this, he would fix it. And yet the relationship, as many of you know, your stakeholders, you're involved in all the time, relies on lots more people who get involved. The president has other things on his agenda, the prime minister has other things on his agenda. Holmes warns us that if we focus too much on the friendship or lack thereof between the leaders, we're missing what's really going on. And we shouldn't obsess over the leaders' partnership. We should focus on the nation's partnership instead. Still valid? Or in this era of celebrity and personality, do the leaders actually mean more and their friendship means more to us? There are not that many principles, don't worry. I just have 10. I figured 10 commandments, 10 principles, it's fine. So the next principle is this idea of diffusion, and I've written about it a little bit myself. As federations, we have a lot of policymakers, not just the national policymakers, but the subnational ones who run states and provinces. And on many issues, because of the way our Constitution's set up, those are the relevant policymakers. It's also true within the federal government in the United States and Canada that at one time the senior diplomats or the president and prime minister could manage the files, maybe the State Department and what we used to call external affairs. But now, just about every department in the US government has day-to-day dealings with their counterparts across the border. And those may be deeper or shallower, but there are regular interactions. You don't go through a gateway or the ambassador to get to your counterpart. What's interesting about that diffusion is that we nonetheless have a remarkable coherence in the management of the relationship. On the details, we leave that to the appropriate level, but the broad principles of friendship seem to be consistent. So what's interesting to me is that we haven't fought diffusion. We've allowed more and more players to get involved in the relationship. There's no nasty note from the Secretary of State that says, Ohio, you shouldn't get involved in a Canada-US issue. You're a sub-federal unit. You don't have the right to be doing anything in international affairs. In fact, quite the opposite. There's a lot of encouragement for state leaders and others to get involved in regional governors associations, regional legislators associations, and some of those are represented here. Is the diffusion still okay, or do we want more centralization? Are we worried about that decentralization even within the federal government? Is it leading us on a road to chaos where nothing seems to work because nobody's in charge? Or is that something we still think is a good principle? Let people get involved at the level they want, and if they can fix it, great. It's a Madisonian issue, to invoke James Madison, about competitive federalism, which is a little bit of a graft onto the Canadian model, but something that Americans believe. But does that make sense for this relationship, or will we be better off if we consolidate it? And lastly, and this is a bit of a motherhood and apple pie one, but it's something that I think is important to remember, at least from my perspective, and that is the idea that the friendship between Canada and the U.S. is fundamentally a friendship of the people of Canada and the United States, who have friends and relatives and social media buddies who cross the border all the time. It is not a government achievement. It isn't the work of Washington and Ottawa. It is out here where everybody every day is dealing with their counterparts. That's why the leaders respond to the public in keeping the relationship on track. Now, I think that gives us a tremendous message of hope at a time of uncertainty, because whether we elect President Trump or President Clinton in this election, or somebody yet to be named, a sort of surprise candidate who comes out with a bang along the way, you never know. It's America. It's always a cliffhanger. Fundamentally, Canada-U.S. relations should stay on track. Why? Because Democratic politicians respond to the public, and the public prefers that we get along because they like each other. And that's not something you can say about Americans in every other country around the world, for sure. It's not something you can say about Canadians in every other country, for sure. If you disagree this principle still applies, I will cry, but it's nonetheless my hope that of all of these principles, we come down to one that really gives us a reason to feel confident this relationship can be resolved. With all of the issues that we're going to raise in the next few days, we can still come back if we still believe this. And on that, I'm going to turn over to Catherine, who's going to walk you through your chance to tell us what you think.
Okay. So, Jim, would you put up the first poll, please? So now we're going to get your perspectives on the principles. Hopefully everybody has some sort of access to the internet. For those of you who don't, I encourage you to take copious notes, to think about this in your head, and then afterward, come up and talk to me or Chris or Beth Ann or Dan and give us your feedback, because it is important. Also, I just want to let you know that after the summit, we are going to be sending out these individualized polls as part of a survey to everybody who's participated and provided feedback to Dan, and to get as much input and insight as possible. So, okay, that is not the first poll. You have to go to the hockey question. We have a warm-up? Yes, okay. So, we have to warm you up to get you used to the polling technology. So I ask that you answer this question, okay? You have, Jim, can you hit that, no. Oh, you guys are already voting. Excellent. All right. I'm elated that the Pittsburgh Penguins won the Stanley Cup Finals. You agree? Pittsburgh's the best team? Not because you like Pittsburgh, but the team from California never should have been in the finals. Disagree, San Jose should have won because they are the best team. Disagree, I would have liked to see Joe Thornton win the cup. That was my husband. My husband wanted that one. I don't like hockey, or I only follow Canadian hockey teams. Okay, so you can see how it's fluctuating, but everybody gets an idea as to how this works, right? This was the warm-up, this is where you're going. Perfect. Okay. So let's get to the first real poll. The next poll, Jim, please. All right. These principles accurately reflect, somewhat reflect, not at all reflect the Canada-U.S. relationship, or I don't know. Somewhat reflect. Oh, wow. Okay, a couple more seconds. Stop changing. Okay, wow, 60% and 40%. We have a limited amount of time, but I'm interested if anybody wants to provide any commentary or their perspective, either on why these principles somewhat reflect the relationship, tell me what you think has changed or what's different, or if they accurately reflect, tell me why these are still the foundations upon which the relationship is based. Very, very quickly. Give me your perspectives. We need to hear from you. Don't be shy. Anybody? Yes, Catherine.
I'm Catherine Buckner. collaborate to solve the problems. Thank you. To solve the problems, to address challenges, to promote the economic value of this asset. So for me, I think we could think about some additional principles that we could add to this list. That's just one, is collaboration, active collaboration.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have any comments or perspective on the principles? Anybody else want to? Oh, yes.
Hi, I'm Daniela Kaufman, and I'm actually a dual citizen, a Canadian living and working in Washington, and a trade lawyer. So I come at it from a personal and professional perspective, and this is more of a personal perspective, which is that I think that some of these concepts, although they still hold true, are a little bit outdated in the perception of Canadians, because I think younger Canadians have a more globalized outlook, whereas in the 80s, 90s, Canadians were changing their perspective on themselves from British to American. I think now they are not as defined by that interdependent relationship, and younger Canadians see themselves more as global citizens, and so you have to take that perspective into account when looking at the Canadian perspective.
Okay, thank you. One more, and then we'll have to move on. Jim, do you want to? And again, I'm not cutting anybody off because your feedback isn't important. It's our time constraints. So please tell us afterward what you think if you don't have the opportunity to voice your perspective publicly.
I think that Chris's points are valid, but I think the biggest reality here is that probably 80% of the U.S. population knows very little about Canada. They don't understand Canada, and I would say 50% of the population don't even know where it is. So I mean, I'm literally telling you the truth here. I travel the country a lot. So I think the biggest issue here is when we deal with 27 states, and you're dealing with the northern end of the country, you're talking to the choir. So I think the real issue here is that how you're going to get the general population of the United States to begin to get involved in these 10 policies, because the sovereignty, the difference, that kind of thing, they're not even known. So I think this is a very critical issue that you're not starting at the first starting gate. You really have a negative barrier here that has to be recognized before you begin to move forward, for what it's worth.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, we'll move to the next poll, Jim. Okay, so this is where you get to rank the principles in terms of importance. Now, I'll tell you, on your phones, it's a little tricky. And there's some instructions that hopefully you read. You have all of the principles listed. Over on the right-hand side, there's like a little button. You have to sort of touch that button, and then you just move the block with the principle up and down until you have them in the order that you want, and then you submit. For those of you who have a laptop, you just have to go over to the left-hand side and click and move the principles into rank order, and it should work fine. The trick with the phones is that sometimes you scroll instead of moving the box, and it might take a couple of seconds for you to get used to that. At least it took me a couple of seconds to get used to it. So if you want to take a couple of minutes to do that and then submit your responses.
Friendship's got to Nobody's.
And then you have to go down to the bottom and I think hit submit response. Okay.
Leaders? Oh. Come on, friendship. It's like a horse race.
I know, it's great, it's great. Okay. Is everybody finished? Okay. Wait, another? I know. Ideally we would spend 3 days doing this. Okay. Ooh. So look at, okay. So interdependence. Oh. All right. I'll close. We'll stop in about 30 seconds. 30 more seconds. Okay, it's static. Okay. Oh. Okay. So, friendship certainly seems to be the bedrock of the relationship. Then we have interdependence, partnership, rule of law, linkage. Look at that. Criticism is down there. I don't know. None of the above. None of the above. Does anybody want to tell me why these are not relevant? I mean, essentially. Or you weren't paying attention. Oh, okay.
You still have to vote for none of the above.
Yeah, it's part of it. Okay. All right. Any comments? Anybody want to tell me why why friendship, interdependence, partnership, rule of the law still remain the foundation of the relationship? I'm sorry?
We didn't want to see Chris cry.
Oh, well, Laura may make Chris cry. Okay, no, well, this is great. This is great. This gives us a really good sense as to what you think about the foundation of the relationship. Now,